Hello everyone, and welcome to your notes on ancient Greece. Today we are starting notes on what we call the classical civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome. And we'll start with Greece, and here are our essential questions for this set of notes. Number 1, what happened during Greece's Dark Ages? Number 2, what major differences do we see between the city-states of Sparta and Athens? And number 3, who are the major Greek philosophers, and why are they important? Okay, so we're going to jump right into one of those essential questions and talk about Greece's Dark Ages. So during the years of 1100 to about 750 BCE, Greece went through a rough time. And we know this because their population declined significantly and their food production also dropped. We know that from records and artifacts of the time, but what we don't know is why. And that's very strange. So we don't have records of what actually happened, really. We just have records that show that the population went from one number to a much lower number and things like that. So there are some theories about this, but we don't know exactly what happened.
The world may never know.
Some of the things that we do know are that large numbers of people left the mainland to go to an area called Ionia. We also know that iron replaced the use of bronze, so bronze stopped being used as much and iron was being used much more. And we also know that the Greeks during this time adopted the Phoenician alphabet, which you'll remember is the precursor to all the alphabets that most languages similar to English are based on. Another thing about this time period in ancient Greece is this is when Homer, who was a Greek historian, was writing a lot of his works. And Homer, not Homer Simpson, but Homer was a historian first and foremost, and he is one of the first ever historians. So he wrote about history, he studied history, and some of the things he wrote about that are important is he wrote about the Trojan War, which is very famous in the city of Troy. He wrote 2 famous works that are still studied by many English majors today, and you might have read parts of them in your English classes, and that's the Odyssey and the Iliad. And in both of these are what we would call epic poems because they're an epic story about a hero going on a journey. And the point of these was to teach courage and honor to the people of Greece. So it's kind of like if you think of fairy tales teaching a lesson, the lesson here was to be courageous and to be honorable. Alright, so now let's look at the way that ancient Greece was organized. So similar to what we saw in Mesopotamia, they have major city-states. And remember, those are just large cities, and within that city, they rule themselves. So there are 2 major city-states that we're going to talk about with ancient Greece, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But to give you an overview of city-states, the city-state was sort of the center of Greek life, and there were different parts of the city that were important for different reasons. So one part of the city was called the Acropolis, and that was a hill that was fortified, and that just means it was built up in such a way that it was easy to protect, and it was used for mainly ceremonies. And then you also had an area called the Agora, and the Agora was an open area where people could get together. It was used as a market. It was sort of the town center. As the polis developed, the need for protection was more and more important, so the military also developed. And this is when 2 major contributions by the ancient Greeks were developed. One is called the hoplites and one is the phalanx. And we'll come back to those in a little bit. Also, as the cities grew and the need for more and more law and order developed, then government became even more important. Ancient Greece is considered to be the creators of democracy and the founders of democracy. Rule of the many is a good way to remember democracy. And the idea is that the power is in the hands of the people being governed. This is a new idea in ancient Greece. So not everywhere in Greece is going to have a democracy. Many polises keep their former form of government, which was called an oligarchy. And to help you remember what oligarchy is, Oligarchy just means rule by the few. So where democracy is ruled by the many, oligarchy is ruled by the few. And that can look different depending on what we're talking about. Some oligarchies are led by two people. So we'll see one where it's two kings. Some oligarchies are ruled by a small group of people. So it might be like a council of leaders. So it just depends. But in general, when we say oligarchy, we just mean a rule by the few. So now let's talk about one of the first major policies in ancient Greece, and that is Sparta.
This is Sparta!
Yes, this is Sparta. And Sparta is a very unique city-state in ancient Greece. First of all, they are known for being very isolated from outsiders. They do not trust outsiders, and they're a very warlike state. So if you've ever heard of or seen posters or seen the movies Sparta, or 300 rather is the movie, then you see like that's their thing. Boys in Sparta left home at the age of 7 to start their military training, which is just kind of crazy to think of a 7-year-old kid, first grader, going off to learn how to fight. But that's just how their lives were. So when you were young, you went off to war. And when you were 20, you finished your training and you were enlisted in the army. And you stayed there for most of your life. Around the age of 30, you're allowed to become more active in politics back at home. So you can vote. You're in the army until you're 60 years old. So that's a long time. And it wasn't just the men that were expected to fight. Women were also expected to be strong and to be able to produce lots of babies. So all Spartans had to be very strong physically. That was a trait that they admired. If a baby was born and they were seen as weak or in some way disabled, they did not live very long in Sparta. Women stayed home while men went off to war, but they had a lot more freedom than women in other city-states in the sense that the men were off at war most of the time. So women were kind of in charge back at home, and they had a lot more ability to go out and about and do what they wanted. Women also supported war just like the men, and in fact, they would send their sons off to fight, and they would tell them, go and come back carrying your shield or come back carried on it. So what that means is they're saying basically, go fight and don't come back unless you win. When it comes to government, Sparta was an oligarchy. So they were the ones that had two kings. And then they had some people below that were helping in the government. So they had first a group of 5 men that were called ephors. And the ephors were elected every year. And they were basically in charge of educating the younger generation and keeping an eye on how everybody in the city-state was acting. Then you had a council of elders, and those guys were made up of the two kings and then 28 citizens that were older than 60. And they were the ones that decided what kind of issues were going to be brought forward to the assembly, which was all the male citizens in Sparta. And these were the only people that voted on major decisions in the government. And it's important to keep in mind, even though it says all male citizens, and that might sound like very inclusive, it's still excluding anyone who's not a citizen, anyone who's not male. Because of the fact that Sparta is very militaristic, they don't let people in from outside. They don't trust outsiders. And so they don't have a lot of outside influence. They're what we would call isolationist, meaning they isolate themselves from everybody else. The other major polis in ancient Greece is called Athens. And Athens was very different from Sparta. So first of all, one of the big differences between Athens and Sparta is their government. Now, they started off the same, where Athens was also an oligarchy, but instead of 2 kings, they were ruled by what we call an aristocracy. So they had a group of upper-class people that were in charge. And they did have an assembly, but the assembly didn't have very much power. Then they had a ruler named Cleisthenes who came along, and Cleisthenes was a reformer. And reform is a word that you'll hear me talk about later on in this class. It will be a very important word. later on. So to reform something, if you think about the way it sounds, is to reform. So to change something, to make it different. And the idea with reform is to change it for the better. Now, Cleisthenes sets up something called the Council of 500, and that is a group that's in charge of supervising any affairs with outsiders, so foreign affairs. And this is very different from Sparta, because remember, Sparta was isolationist. They didn't want anything to do with outsiders. So this is very different, and it gives them a lot of opportunities that Sparta doesn't necessarily have. The council is also in charge of overseeing the money, the treasury, and they also come up with laws that are going to be voted on by the assembly. So all of this sort of lays the foundations for democracy. And so Athens specifically is considered the city-state that founded democracy. So you'll hear it said two ways. Democracy was founded in Greece, and then to be more specific, you could say it was founded in Athens in Greece. So let's go into what that looked like, because it didn't look like what we know today as democracy. So during a time called the Age of Pericles, the earliest form of democracy is what we call direct democracy. And it's just like it sounds. It means that if democracy is putting power in the hands of the people, then in a direct democracy, it means people have a direct control over the government. So they participate directly. And what that really means on a practical level is that they would get every citizen together and they would debate an issue, and every citizen would have a say in what was happening. They would have a say in making the decision. So everybody voted on every single issue. This isn't what we have in the US today. We do have a democratic type of government. We do get to vote on things, but only people of a certain age who are, meet certain requirements are allowed to vote. And so it's not everybody. And then even then, we're not the ones in office making decisions on a day-to-day basis. What we do is we vote for somebody else who does that. So we do not have a direct democracy. But in ancient Athens, this is what they had. And it makes sense because there are a lot fewer people in ancient Athens than there are in the United States today. There are millions of people in the United States. And I always use the example of if we just tried to get our class to decide on a pizza topping and had everybody vote and everybody had to agree, I don't think we could do it.
It'll be anarchy!
So imagine trying to do that with millions of Americans. We already know Americans can't agree on anything. So it's not as practical to have a direct democracy nowadays. But back then, it was a lot easier and it made more sense. Within this direct democracy, all male citizens had a role in the government, and there were some people who had special roles. So, for example, there were generals who were the main, at the peak of government, they were at the top. 10 generals were voted on every year. They were kind of kept in check because if a politician got too ambitious, if they tried to make themselves more powerful than the others, then there was sort of this social punishment. Under Pericles, Athens is going to become basically the center of Greek culture. So this is why when we think of ancient Greece, we tend to picture Athenians more than Spartans, because the Spartans were the exception to the rule. So for example, their economy was based on trade and farming, and they did this because most of the grain that they needed for their food had to come from outside of Athens. So they didn't produce enough. They didn't have enough grain in their own area, so they had to import more than 50%, sometimes up to 80% of that grain came from outside of Athens. So they couldn't afford to be like Sparta and isolate themselves. They had to reach out to others and build those relationships. As far as the social aspect of Athens, women in Athens had a lot less freedom than the women in Sparta. Number one, they were not allowed to participate in most public life. They were only really allowed to get out and go to religious festivals. And even then, when they were out and about, they always had to have a male guardian with them. So can you imagine if you always had to have an older brother with you every time you went to the store or hung out with your friends or whatever that might be, went to a movie? So this is what it was like for women in Athens. the goal for a woman in Athens was to be a good wife and to bear lots of children. So that's one similarity in that women in Athens and Sparta were expected to have lots and lots of babies. So, spoiler alert, that's big in most ancient civilizations. Women were the baby makers. And just in general, women were very strictly controlled in Athens. So they just didn't have as much freedom.